Nobody here knows who I really am, and nobody ever questions me. That is about to change.
We were never supposed to see this.
What exactly are you doing in there?
If he finds out what we copied.
Open the door.
I didn't do this!
The evidence says otherwise.
Someone wants us gone.
Who are you?
The man who owns this hotel.
Who are you?
You spent years running my hotel without ever knowing who I was.
That's impossible.
No, you just never thought I walked through that door. Today, everything changes.
We tried to tell the truth even when nobody wanted to hear it.
This hotel wasn't saved by me. It was saved by them.
We only did what was right. The truth always finds its way out.
No employee at the front desk of the Kingsley Grand recognized the black man in the worn jacket standing at the counter. The man whose name was on the building, whose signature was on every deed, whose face had never appeared in a uniform. Adrian Kingsley had come with a false name and the smallest available room, and no one in his entire organization knew he was there. He wanted to see his empire as it actually was. But he had barely been on the property a day before he overheard two housekeepers speaking in a service corridor, and one of them whispered, "If Mr. Kingsley ever found out what's in that room, Everett Blackwell would lose everything." Stay with this to the end. What was hidden inside that room was enough to bring everything crashing down. The Kingsley Grand had opened on a gray November morning 12 years earlier, and Adrian had stood on the sidewalk across the street, watching guests walk through its revolving doors, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had built something from nothing. He was 43 years old now, founder and chief executive of Kingsley Crown Hospitality, a luxury brand with 11 properties, and a reputation that had survived recessions, and the relentless churn of the travel industry. The Chicago flagship was the crown jewel, the property he had purchased with the first real money he ever held. The building his mother had walked through with him before she died, marveling at the height of the ceilings. She had spent 22 years cleaning rooms in a budget property 30 miles away, and Adrian had always said his hotels would treat employees the way hers never had. That claim now sat in his chest like a stone as he rolled his carry-on across the lobby floor and studied the face of a bellman who flinched when a supervisor walked past. The decision to make this visit had not been sudden. For 6 months, the attrition numbers at Kingsley Grand had told a story that the operational reports refused to acknowledge. Turnover in housekeeping and food service had climbed past 40%, a figure that would have caused alarm at any property but appeared nowhere in Everett Blackwell's presentations. The general manager had been with the company for 9 years, and in that time had cultivated a reputation as one of the most polished operators in the hospitality industry. A man who could make any problem look like a talking point, and any complaint look like a learning opportunity. His reports arrived formatted like architectural blueprints, precise and impeccable, and they consistently showed the Chicago property performing above every internal benchmark. Yet something in the margins had begun to nag at Adrian. Internal complaint filings, routed through the corporate portal that simply stopped arriving from this address, followed by a brief, professional email from Blackwell, noting that the new grievance workflow had streamlined resolution at the property level. It had seemed reasonable at the time. Now it struck Adrian as the kind of sentence a man writes when he has decided to stop letting inconvenient truths travel upward. He checked in without ceremony, paid for 3 nights, and carried his own bag to the elevator. The front desk associate who processed his reservation kept glancing toward a fixed camera above the counter before answering any question, a habit so ingrained it appeared involuntary, like checking a wound. In the elevator, a young man in a housekeeping uniform stepped aside with an exaggerated deference that Adrian found immediately troubling. Not because courtesy was unwelcome, but because the expression beneath it was the expression of a person who has learned that any interaction with a guest can go wrong in ways that cost them later. Adrian thanked him by name, reading his badge, and the young man looked briefly startled before composing himself. That flicker of surprise, at being seen, at being thanked, at the plainest possible acknowledgement, settled into Adrian's memory and stayed there. His room was clean, competently furnished, and unremarkable. From the window, he could see the service entrance below, where delivery trucks moved in and out with mechanical regularity. He ate dinner alone at the hotel bar and watched Everett Blackwell work the room with the practiced ease of a man who had been performing competence for so long it had become indistinguishable from the real thing. Blackwell moved between tables of well-dressed guests with warmth and fluency, bending slightly at the waist when he laughed, touching elbows and remembering names. When a young server dropped a spoon near the service station, Blackwell did not look up immediately. He finished his sentence with the guest at table 9, smiled, straightened, and then turned to the floor manager and said something quiet and deliberate that resulted in the server being walked to the back office before her shift was over. Adrian watched all of this from his bar stool with a glass of water in his hand and said nothing. He ordered the same thing twice, so no one would notice how long he had been sitting there. By the time he returned to his room that night, he had already revised the story he had told himself about this property for years. The lobby was as beautiful as it had ever been. The service was technically proficient. The guests at the high-topped tables laughed and ordered second rounds and took photographs of their food. But underneath the performance was a low, persistent tension, the kind that accumulates in workplaces where people have learned that the wrong word to the wrong person can cost them a shift, a reference, or the job itself. Adrian recognized it because he had felt something like it once, long before he was the man whose name was on the building. He lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, and thought about the reports. Then he thought about the space between the reports and the room he was in, and how large that space had become, without him ever noticing it grow. The next morning he rose early, dressed in the same plain clothes, and went looking for the machines on the service stairwell that sold bottled water at 2 in the morning. He found them on the 12th floor landing, and he found something else on the 14th. 2 voices through a partially open supply room door, low and careful, the kind of conversation people have when they need the walls to be thicker than they are. Adrian stopped on the stairs above and did not move. He was not trying to eavesdrop in any calculated sense. He simply recognized the weight of what he was hearing before he fully understood the words, the way you recognize a language before you can parse its meaning. The woman speaking fastest was younger. Her name, he would later learn, was Mariah Sutton, 29 years old, a housekeeper in her 2nd year at the property. The woman who answered her, measured, deliberate with the authority of someone who had already decided what she believed, was Tessa Brooks, 38, a senior housekeeper who had been with the Kingsley Grand for 7 years. Mariah was frightened. She had been frightened for 3 days, since Everett Blackwell had stopped her in the service corridor and asked her, in a tone that carried no question mark, whether she had been near the storage area designated as Unit 17. She had said no. She had said it the way people say things they know will be checked. And now she was telling Tessa that what she had seen inside that room, briefly, accidentally, during a Thursday afternoon when the corridor was empty and the door had not latched properly, had not left her head since. There were invoices in there, she said, dozens of them, printed and sorted into folders, made out to vendors whose names she had never seen on any supply order or contract list. There were sealed envelopes. There were personnel files she recognized, files that belonged in the human resources system, not in an unlocked cabinet in a secondary storage room on the 14th floor. And there was something else, something she described in a half-sentence that trailed off before completion, but whose shape Adrian could already begin to feel. Tessa's response was careful. She told Mariah not to go back. She told her that going back would not make what she had seen safer to carry, only heavier. But her voice held a quality that told Adrian she was not surprised. The quality of a woman who had been circling this particular drain for a long time and had not yet found the words to describe its shape to someone else. Tessa had filed 3 internal complaints through the corporate grievance portal in 14 months. Each had documented a specific pattern, shift reductions applied to employees who asked about missing overtime, written warnings issued to those who had spoken to the prior department head before he was quietly transferred, and 4 colleagues told their performance bonuses had been suspended pending a budget review that no one could produce documentation for. All 3 complaints had been acknowledged by the system and then forwarded back to the general manager's office within days. After each one, Tessa's monthly scheduling had been reduced by 8 to 10 hours without formal explanation. Mariah said that Blackwell had already started moving things. She had seen 2 of his assistants carrying boxes from the corridor the previous afternoon, and one of them had made eye contact with her in a way that she described as a warning. The audit was scheduled for the end of the week. Whatever was in that room, Blackwell intended to have it somewhere else before outside eyes arrived. Then Mariah said the thing that Adrian would replay in his head for months afterward, the sentence that arrived not as an accusation but as a simple statement of understood fact. If Mr. Kingsley ever found out what's in that room, Everett Blackwell would lose everything. And Tessa answered without a pause, Mr. Kingsley gets the reports Everett wants him to get. That's not the same as knowing. Adrian stood in the stairwell with his hand flat against the painted cinder block and said nothing. The water machine hummed on the landing above him. He stayed there long enough to hear the supply room door pull shut and the sound of a cart being wheeled away, and then he went back to his room and called Victoria Langford. Victoria Langford was the chair of the Kingsley Crown Board, a woman whose presence in any room altered its temperature, who had been in the hospitality investment world for 30 years, and who had a habit of knowing things before she was told them. Adrian reached her before 7 in the morning and told her in broad terms what he had heard and what he suspected, and she told him in precise terms what she could verify from the corporate system without triggering a flag visible to regional management. Within 90 minutes, she had sent him 3 documents by encrypted channel. The first showed that every grievance submission from the Kingsley Grand address had been routed, without exception, back to the on-site management team. The second showed overtime hours reported for the property running at roughly 40% of what would be expected, given its occupancy rate, a figure that suggested employees were regularly working hours that never made it into the payroll system. The third was a vendor ledger extract showing 12 contract accounts activated in the past 18 months, all of them with billing addresses in the same zip code, none of them appearing in any approved supplier directory. Adrian spent the morning as Aaron Cole, moving through the property at the unhurried pace of a guest with nowhere to be. He ate breakfast at the buffet and asked the young woman refilling the orange juice how long she had been working there. She told him 4 months, and then looked briefly uncertain, as though being asked about her own tenure was a question she needed to evaluate for risk before answering. He sat in the lobby with a newspaper and watched the morning shift change, observing how supervisors spoke to their teams and how those teams carried themselves when the supervisors were no longer looking. He walked through the fitness center and the business lounge and the corridor of meeting rooms, speaking to no one for long stretches, and then, in the early afternoon, he found a seat near the service bar and watched Blackwell conduct a stand-up with 3 department managers at a small table in the corner. The general manager's posture was immaculate. He used a tablet to reference numbers and pointed to figures with one manicured finger, while his managers nodded with the careful attentiveness of people who have learned to agree at speed. What Adrian was assembling was not yet evidence. It was the architecture of a system, the structure of how Blackwell had made the Kingsley Grand appear to function beautifully while redirecting its real operational costs onto the people with the least power to object. Adrian had seen enough fraud cases in the industry to recognize the method. Reduce your documented labor cost by pushing hours off the books. Manufacture your performance metrics by controlling what gets reported upward. Suppress your complaint volume by making sure complaints never leave the building. And cover your financial exposure by running contractor payments through entities you own or influence. Done with sufficient patience and administrative fluency, it was nearly invisible. The guests were largely happy. The margins looked excellent on paper. And the people who could have described the real cost of those margins had nowhere to send what they knew. That afternoon, Holden Whitaker, the property's head of security, received a notification flagging an unusual pattern in the interactions of a guest registered as Aaron Cole. Too many conversations with staff, too much time in non-guest corridors, too many questions that didn't map cleanly onto the profile of a traveling executive. Whitaker pulled the camera footage and the payment record. The payment had been processed through a routing account that, when traced 2 layers back, connected to a financial entity associated with Kingsley Crown's administrative infrastructure. Whitaker printed the results and sent them to Blackwell without annotation. The implication was already plain enough. Blackwell studied the image on his screen. He opened a browser window and navigated to a 3-year-old press photograph from a hospitality industry conference. He looked at it for a long time. Then he closed the window, leaned back in his chair, and began to think about what options remained available to him. Because the thing that a man like Everett Blackwell understood was that there is no moment that cannot be managed if you move fast enough and precisely enough, and with just enough apparent authority to make other people hesitate before they question you. Mariah did not sleep well that night, and by early morning she had made a decision she knew Tessa would push back on. She was going back to Unit 17 before Blackwell's people cleared it out. She told herself it was about evidence. She told herself it was about the 4 colleagues who had never received their bonuses, and about the housekeeper named Donna, who had been handed a stack of disciplinary warnings the week after filing an overtime complaint, and had been gone within the month. She told herself it was not about fear, even though fear was exactly what drove her down that corridor before the morning shift began, Tessa moving 2 steps behind her, after losing the argument against going. Tessa had lost it because she understood, however reluctantly, that the only thing worse than going was watching the evidence disappear, and spending the rest of her time at this property knowing exactly what she had let happen. The door to Unit 17 was locked, but Mariah had kept the secondary key from a rotation assignment 3 weeks earlier, a thing she had done without calculation at the time, and which had since begun to feel like something more deliberate than it was. The room was small and smelled of paper and something faintly chemical. Along the left wall, in lateral filing containers and stacked cardboard boxes, was a record of the past 2 years of Blackwell's operation that no one in the corporate system had ever been permitted to read. There were invoices bearing the names of vendors who could not be found in any business directory, their addresses resolving to parking structures and vacant commercial lots when mapped. There were personnel files containing disciplinary notations added retroactively. Mariah recognized the handwriting, recognized the dates that didn't align with the incident descriptions. There were sealed envelopes holding gift cards, designated by policy for guests who had submitted formal complaints, every one of them undelivered. There was a box containing watches, jewelry, and a leather wallet monogrammed with initials, none of which had ever appeared in the hotel's lost and found log. And there were contracts, service and supply agreements signed against Celeste Davenport's electronic signature, entered into with a company whose registered agent shared a surname with Blackwell's brother. In the far corner of the second shelf was a portable hard drive in a black case, labeled with no text, connected to nothing. Adrian appeared in the doorway behind them. He had been watching the 14th floor since 5 in the morning, waiting for exactly this kind of movement, and had bought himself the necessary window by placing a maintenance call about a pressure fluctuation in room 1412. A call that pulled the floor engineer and the duty manager to the opposite end of the corridor for 18 minutes. Tessa spun around and told him immediately, and without softening, that he needed to leave. She did not raise her voice, but she made it clear that the consequences of a guest wandering into this space were consequences she could not afford. Mariah was already moving toward the boxes, trying to determine what was most important to photograph first. Adrian closed the door behind him. He told them he was not a regular guest. He told them he had heard their conversation the previous morning through the stairwell door, and that he believed everything they had said. He told them he had a direct line to the company's board of directors, that the audit process could be accelerated, and that what was in this room needed to be copied and secured before Blackwell's people arrived to move it. He did not tell them who he was. Tessa studied him with the flat, evaluating gaze of a woman who has heard promises from people with authority before and tracked what happened next. And she told him plainly that the last person who had told her the system would take care of things had been a human resources coordinator who had handed her a feedback form and then transferred to another property 2 weeks later. Adrian did not argue with this assessment. He said that all he was asking for was the time to make a copy, that the rest was her decision, and that he would not pretend to guarantee outcomes he could not guarantee. They copied what they could in 11 minutes. Tessa pulled the hard drive and tucked it deep beneath the linens on her cart. Mariah photographed the invoices and the contracts with her personal phone, her hands not entirely steady. Adrian went through the personnel files quickly and methodically, reading dates and names, his jaw tight. Then they heard footsteps in the corridor outside, distinct and unhurried and purposeful, the particular gait of someone who has already decided what he is going to find. The door handle moved. Blackwell's voice came through the gap, measured, courteous in the way that only a threat can be, asking why the door to Unit 17 was standing open. Tessa's hand moved first. She was already at the cart, straightening the linens over the hard drive, with a motion so practiced it looked like nothing at all. Adrian stepped into the corridor ahead of the two women and let his voice carry the offended register of a guest who had been inconvenienced. He had been attempting to find the service elevator and had apparently been directed incorrectly, and he found it rather alarming that a corridor of this kind was accessible without any guidance from staff. Blackwell's expression realigned itself in a fraction of a second. The professional hospitality reflex was instantaneous and nearly flawless. Apology, explanation, the offer of a personal escort. But his eyes did not leave Adrian's face while he spoke, and Adrian felt the assessment running behind the courtesy like a secondary process, cataloging, comparing, calculating. When Blackwell turned to address Tessa and Mariah, the register dropped entirely. He asked, in a tone designed to carry just far enough for both women to hear, what they had been doing in a restricted storage area outside of their assigned duties. Tessa said they had been completing a linen inventory, which was true in the sense that linen inventory was a task she performed regularly on that floor, and Blackwell heard the technical accuracy of it and gave nothing in response. He had no evidence yet. The cart was in the corridor. The door had been open, but the room appeared undisturbed. He could not fire them in this moment without documenting a specific violation, and he needed documentation he could defend in front of a witness, including the witness currently standing in the hallway, pretending to be irritated about the elevator. He suspended Mariah that afternoon. The language in the suspension notice cited a security protocol violation, unauthorized access to a restricted area, and the timing of its issuance was precise enough to communicate exactly what it was intended to communicate. Mariah read it in the break room, with Tessa sitting next to her, and said almost nothing. Tessa was issued a final written warning for the same violation. Neither document contained the word termination, but both women understood the gap between where those documents began and where the next one would end. Adrian watched the delivery of both notices from a position near the concierge desk, with a newspaper open in front of him that he had not read a word of since 9 in the morning. He called Victoria again. She told him that Holden Whitaker had been in contact with Blackwell's administrative account 3 times in the past 2 hours, and that one of those transmissions had carried a file attachment consistent in size with a camera archive export. Victoria told him that if they were going to move, they needed to move before the weekend, because the audit firm's access window opened on Friday, and anything missing from the system before that point would require a formal evidentiary recovery process that would take weeks. Adrian said he understood. He said he needed 1 more day to let the full picture come into focus. Victoria said she would dispatch Celeste Davenport to Chicago by morning, with the financial documentation already pulled from the corporate system. Adrian thanked her and ended the call, and sat for a moment in the lobby of the hotel that bore his name, surrounded by the low orchestral hum of an institution performing its perfection for an audience of paying guests, and felt the exact weight of the distance between what he had believed and what was true. Blackwell had determined by evening that Aaron Cole and Adrian Kingsley were the same person. He sat with that knowledge for 2 hours before deciding on his response, which was not flight but reframing, the construction of an alternative narrative, aggressive enough to get ahead of whatever Adrian was preparing. He called the Chicago Police Department's non-emergency line and filed a report of theft by employees, citing inventory documentation and the discovery of guest property in the personal storage of 2 housekeeping staff. He provided Holden's name as the witnessing security officer. He requested that both employees be detained on the property the following morning pending formal statement collection. He did this at 11:47 at night, in the calm and methodical manner of a man executing a plan he had been holding in reserve for exactly this kind of contingency. The next morning arrived overcast and cold, and Tessa and Mariah had not yet reached the service entrance, before 2 uniformed security officers and Holden Whitaker were waiting for them in the corridor. Whitaker led both women to the employee locker area under the stated purpose of a routine inspection, a process that was not, technically, routine. And in the course of that inspection produced, from the shelf of Tessa's locker, a lady's watch in a monogrammed case and an envelope containing $400 in cash, both items matching entries on the hotel's confidential lost and found ledger. From Mariah's locker, he produced a pair of drop earrings in a small velvet pouch that matched a guest complaint filed 8 weeks earlier. Tessa looked at the watch as it was placed on the table between them and understood, with the complete and immediate clarity of a woman who has been lied to before in ways she could not prove, exactly what had happened. She turned to Mariah and said one thing, which was, "Do not sign anything." Mariah was frightened in the way that people are frightened when they have done nothing wrong and can feel themselves being enclosed by a system that doesn't care. Tessa put one hand briefly on Mariah's forearm and said it again quietly and with great certainty, "Do not sign anything." Blackwell arrived at the locker room in a charcoal suit, conveying the expression of a man performing disappointment with great precision. He addressed Tessa first, using the formal register he employed, when he wanted everyone within hearing distance to understand that what was happening was official. He said that her tenure with the property had been marked by repeated disciplinary issues, that he had extended considerable latitude in the interest of fairness, and that the discovery of guest property in her assigned storage space left him with no alternative but to proceed with termination and referral to law enforcement. He said this in front of 4 witnesses. Tessa did not respond. She looked at him steadily, without expression, in the manner of someone conserving what they know for when it will matter most. Adrian stepped into the room from the corridor behind Whitaker. He was still in the plain jacket. He asked, in the even tone of someone who had been gathering information for 4 days and now intended to use it, whether it would be appropriate to allow an independent observer to be present during the formal statement process, given that the property appeared to be experiencing some procedurally irregular circumstances. Blackwell turned to face him with the practiced fluency of a manager addressing an unwelcome situation and said that this was an internal personnel matter and that guest presence in a restricted staff area was itself a policy concern. Adrian asked why the camera covering the section of locker corridor nearest to Tessa's unit had been offline for 17 minutes the previous evening. He asked this without emphasis or accusation, in the flat and particular tone of someone reading from a record. Blackwell said the system had been undergoing routine maintenance. Adrian asked whether routine maintenance was typically scheduled during an active security investigation. There was a half-second that lived between those 2 sentences, a delay so brief it would have been invisible to anyone not looking for it, and in that half-second, something shifted in the room that was not visible but was felt by everyone in it. The lobby doors opened at that moment, and Celeste Davenport walked in, carrying a document case, and the particular expression of someone who has been on an early flight and has not had coffee but intends to be functional anyway. Behind her were 2 men in suits who moved with the purposeful economy of people who review financial records for a living. Blackwell looked at Celeste, and then looked at the 2 men, and then looked at Adrian, and the architecture of his expression, the competence, the authority, the performance of certainty, developed a fracture along a line that had always been there, underneath everything. He told Adrian that he was a guest, that he had no standing in a personnel matter, and that if he was unwilling to remove himself from the area, security would assist him in doing so. Adrian looked at him for a moment. Then he asked a single question. If Adrian Kingsley were standing in front of you right now, how would you explain what's been happening in this hotel? Blackwell answered without hesitation, with the cool confidence of a man who has decided that the best defense of a lie is to commit to it completely. Mr. Kingsley doesn't concern himself with operational details at this level. That's why he employs people like me. Adrian reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a laminated executive identification card issued by Kingsley Crown Hospitality, the kind that carried a photograph, a title, and a silver seal in the lower right corner. He held it up without theatrics and said, in a voice that carried no particular effort to be dramatic, "You have been correct about one thing. I have not been paying close enough attention. That ends today." The silence that followed was not brief. It moved through the room and then moved out through the door and into the corridor beyond, and it reached the lobby before anyone spoke again. The front desk associate, who had been watching the service wing cameras all morning, would later describe what she heard as a kind of stillness. The way a very loud room goes quiet when it realizes it has been listening to the wrong person. Holden Whitaker, who had been standing to Blackwell's left with his arms crossed in the posture of a man backing the winning side, looked at the identification card and then at the floor. Blackwell himself underwent no dramatic transformation. He did not lose his composure in any visible sense. What left him was subtler than composure. It was the quality of certainty, the proprietary confidence of a man who has operated without consequence for long enough that consequence itself has begun to seem hypothetical. He said that there had been a misunderstanding. He said that the situation with the two employees was a straightforward internal disciplinary matter that had been handled according to established policy. He said that whatever had prompted Mr. Kingsley's visit, he was certain that a clear-headed review of the property's records would confirm the management team's integrity. Adrian told him, without raising his voice, to step aside. He asked Whitaker to open the full camera archive from the past 72 hours, including all backup channels. He asked Celeste to begin the process of sealing the financial accounts accessible from the general manager's administrative terminal. Whitaker hesitated. The hesitation of a man running a rapid internal calculation about which version of this story was going to be better for his continued employment, and then moved to comply. Blackwell tried a different approach. He told Adrian that Holden had occasionally made operational judgments the general manager had not been fully informed of, and that certain irregularities in the security record could be attributed to a subordinate acting without direction. Whitaker looked up from the terminal he was accessing. The decision he made in the next 4 seconds to speak came not from loyalty or principle, but from the recognition that Blackwell had just handed him the role of primary culpable party and expected him to hold it without complaint. He said that the camera shutdown on the corridor in question had been requested by text message from Blackwell's registered device at 11:21 the previous evening, and said it flatly, in the tone of a man reading a sentence he has agreed to read. Victoria Langford arrived at the property 30 minutes later, with the company's legal team and an external audit coordinator, having been in the air since before dawn. The lobby reconfigured itself around her presence in the way lobbies do, around people who have the authority to alter what happens in them. The legal team moved immediately to the 14th floor. The audit coordinator began working through Celeste's document set. Blackwell remained in the ground floor conference room with 2 attorneys, one of them his own, and what followed was not a confrontation of the kind that announces itself, but the slow, technical dismantling of a construction that had been designed to withstand exactly this kind of scrutiny, which meant it had been designed to withstand it until it couldn't. The camera backup servers, hosted on an off-site vendor platform Blackwell had not had access to, showed Whitaker entering the locker corridor at 11:36 and placing items in the assigned storage of both employees within a 4-minute window. The footage was clear, time-stamped, and could not be explained by maintenance schedules or subordinate overreach. Holden provided a written statement within 2 hours. Adrian stood at the window of the conference room while this was happening and watched the street below. The traffic, the pedestrians, the ordinary industrious motion of a city going about its work, and thought about 47 people. That was the number he had seen on a document in Unit 1747 former employees who had been separated from the property in the prior 2 years, some through termination, some through resignation under documented pressure, some through a pattern of disciplinary escalation so deliberate and so consistently applied that its design was visible only in aggregate. 47 people who had needed this job and had lost it, and whose departure had been coded in the system as routine attrition, while Blackwell's metrics continued to look immaculate. He asked Tessa to come into the conference room. She came in alone, leaving Mariah in the corridor, and she sat across from him with her hands flat on the table and waited. Adrian told her that the property was his, that he was Adrian Kingsley, that he had heard her and Mariah speaking in the supply room 2 mornings earlier, and that everything she had described was being confirmed by the evidence already in hand. Tessa listened to all of this without interruption. When he finished, she said, "You didn't need to go undercover to know your employees were hurting. You needed to build a system that let us tell you." The full scope of what Blackwell had been doing took the audit team the better part of 3 days to document, but the shape of it became clear within hours. The labor theft was extensive. Overtime hours worked off the books, bonuses calculated on paper and never distributed, shift hours logged and then quietly revised downward before payroll processing. The vendor fraud was systematic. 12 shell contracting entities, most of them with indirect ownership ties to Blackwell or his immediate family, that had received payments totaling several $1,000,000 over 22 months for services the hotel had either never received or had received from other providers at significantly lower cost. Celeste's electronic signature had been applied to a number of these contracts without her knowledge, pulled from the digital authorization system through a process she had not consented to and had not detected because the relevant line items had been buried in quarterly budget amendments. She had trusted Blackwell to summarize accurately. But the document folder on the portable hard drive, the one Tessa had moved in 11 minutes flat from a shelf in Unit 17 to the bottom of a linen cart, contained a third layer that made the first 2 look like preparation. The folder was named Crown Exit. Inside it was an 18-month operational plan, a series of coordinated actions designed to depress the assessed value of the Kingsley Grand property below its actual market worth, at which point a private acquisition vehicle, owned through several intermediary entities, one of which carried Blackwell's family name, and another of which included 2 outside investors, whose identities the legal team was still working to establish, would purchase the property at the artificially reduced price. Once the transaction was complete, Blackwell's position in the acquiring entity would convert him from employee to partial owner. The mechanism for depressing the value was managerial sabotage, deliberately deferred maintenance on systems requiring expensive future remediation, manufactured staff crises designed to push turnover above industry thresholds, manipulated cost reporting to create the appearance of structural inefficiency, and the preparation of a documented regulatory complaint constructed from falsified records, timed to be filed 3 weeks before the anticipated acquisition window. Tessa's and Mariah's accidental discovery of Unit 17 had not simply threatened Blackwell's labor fraud. It had threatened the entire timeline of an operation he had been building for 2 years. Adrian sat with this for a long time before he spoke again. He sat with the understanding that if those 2 women had stayed quiet, if Mariah had walked past that improperly latched door 3 weeks ago and kept walking, if Tessa had decided that her 3 failed complaints were sufficient evidence that the system could not be trusted, he would have arrived at some future quarter to find the Chicago flagship underperforming, the staff decimated, the brand damaged in ways that would have taken years to trace back to their origin. He would have sold it, possibly at the moment of maximum depreciation, into the hands of the man who had engineered its decline. He told Victoria this. Victoria told him, with the measured directness of someone who has been in difficult rooms before, that the more urgent question was what he was going to do now. Blackwell was placed on immediate administrative suspension and transferred to the company's legal and compliance team pending the formal referral of evidence to federal investigators. He offered in the conference room one final reframing, that his actions had been the actions of an operator who had been forced to improvise solutions, because the corporate structure had never adequately compensated the people who actually ran its properties. He said this without visible shame, in the tone of someone who has rehearsed it and believes that articulation is indistinguishable from justification. Adrian listened to the entire statement. Then he said, "You didn't build anything here. The people you stole from built it. You just controlled how long they could keep working on it." Holden Whitaker was terminated and referred separately. The police report Blackwell had filed the previous evening was retracted by the company's legal team before noon. No charges were pursued against Tessa Brooks or Mariah Sutton. The items planted in their lockers were returned to the hotel's lost and found ledger, where they were held pending contact with their original owners. 3 days after the suspension of Everett Blackwell, Adrian Kingsley stood in front of the assembled staff of the Kingsley Grand in the hotel's largest conference room. Not the ballroom, not the executive event suite, but the ordinary meeting room on the 3rd floor, where the morning shift briefings happened every day at 6:45. He did not have a prepared statement. He had a list of things he believed needed to be said directly, without the mediation of communications teams or carefully reviewed language. He started with the number 47. He said the names would be tracked, the financial records reviewed, and every person owed compensation would receive it with documentation and without condition. He said the labor theft that had occurred under his company's name was not a failure of management alone. It was a failure of structure, of accountability architecture, of the assumption that a well-designed system would protect itself without the people inside it being able to reach anyone above it. Tessa spoke. She had been given the floor, not because Adrian managed the agenda, but because she had asked for it, and because several colleagues had requested she represent them. She stood in front of a room of people she had worked alongside for years and said what she required, not requested, but required, as a condition of the hotel continuing to function in any way she was willing to be part of. Full restitution of all wages stolen from current and former employees, verifiable and time-bound. Independent compensation review for all employees whose disciplinary records had been manufactured or inflated. A grievance reporting mechanism that delivered complaints directly to the board, without passing through any intermediate management layer. The right for frontline employees to address the board directly at a fixed interval each year. And an end to the practice of evaluating general managers exclusively on margin and occupancy metrics, without any structured accountability for employee retention or ethics compliance. Adrian agreed to each point. Tessa told him that agreement was not what she was looking for, because she had received agreements before. She was looking for a governance structure that would make the agreement enforceable, without requiring her to file a complaint. Adrian said he understood and that he would commit to a monitoring process with employee-elected oversight. He said this carefully, because he had learned in the past 4 days to be careful about the distance between saying a thing and meaning it in a way that survives the moment. Mariah was offered her position back effective immediately, with back pay for every hour of the suspension. She did not give an immediate answer. She said she needed a few days to decide whether this was still the place she wanted to be. Adrian told her that was completely reasonable, and that the decision was hers to make. He said he was sorry that his company had made her afraid to tell the truth, and he meant it in the way that a person means something when there is no way to make it smaller or dress it differently. Celeste was appointed interim general manager under the oversight of a newly formed property governance committee that included 2 frontline employee representatives. The committee would have review access to all personnel decisions above a defined threshold of impact and would submit independent reports to the board quarterly. The process of rebuilding the vendor contracts began the following week, with each line item requiring dual authorization and an independent vendor registry check. The lost property recovered from Unit 17 was cataloged and matched against guest complaint records. 15 of the 23 items were successfully returned to their original owners within the month. Refunds were issued for each case where physical property had been retained past the reasonable recovery window. The financial exposure was significant. Adrian signed each authorization personally. 6 months after the events of that November week, the Kingsley Grand reopened its employee dining room, a space that had been converted to additional storage sometime in the previous administration and that the new property committee had voted to restore within their first meeting. The overtime pay restoration had been completed for all current employees and was in process for 41 of the 47 individuals identified in the Unit 17 files. The voluntary attrition rate had fallen from its 18-month high of 42% to 11% over 2 quarters, a shift that became a case study in the company's internal operations review, but that Adrian declined to publicize externally. Tessa Brooks accepted the position of Director of Employee Experience at the Chicago property on one condition, that the title would not prevent her from spending time on each floor, speaking directly with housekeepers and maintenance staff and kitchen workers, and that her reports would go to the board as well as to the interim general manager. She had watched too many people move from the floor into an office and gradually stop knowing what was happening on the floor. She did not intend to become one of them. The condition was accepted in writing. Mariah Sutton returned to the property after 5 days and was appointed Internal Compliance Coordinator, a newly created role that gave her the authority to review personnel records, flag discrepancies in the disciplinary system, and escalate anomalies directly to Celeste and to the board representative. The instinct that had led her to notice what didn't belong, the kind of noticing that Blackwell had tried to turn into a liability, was now the formal center of her job description. Adrian visited the property without announcement on 4 occasions in the 6 months that followed, but he did not arrive in a plain jacket or a borrowed name. He arrived as himself, ate in the staff cafeteria, attended 2 morning briefings, and sat through 1 full employee feedback session without speaking until the room had finished. He had been a person who received information through layers and intervals, and the particular filter that accumulates around a name when it becomes a brand. He was trying, slowly and imperfectly, to become a different kind of person. One who had built enough structure around the truth that the truth could reach him even when it was inconvenient. At the reopening event that spring, several industry publications wanted to run the story as an account of a visionary CEO who had gone undercover to expose corruption and save his own institution. Adrian declined to participate in any framing of that kind. He understood the appeal of it. He also understood that the story it told was not accurate in the way that mattered. When he was invited to say a few words at the event, he kept it short. He said that the Kingsley Grand had not been saved by its founder. It had been saved by 2 women who had told the truth at the precise moment when telling the truth was the most costly thing available to them, and who had kept telling it even when the machinery around them was designed to make them stop. He then handed the ribbon to Tessa and Mariah and stepped back from the podium. Near the end of the evening, a new hire in banquet service asked Tessa, quietly and without quite looking at her, whether people who held power ever actually changed. Tessa glanced across the room to where Adrian was helping an older room service attendant maneuver a heavy cart through a doorway that the remodel had made slightly narrower than it should have been. She watched him hold the door for a moment and then take the other end of the cart and help push it through. She turned back to the new hire and said, "They change when we stop letting them pretend they don't know what's happening in their own house." The ribbon fell. The lobby filled with the sound of guests arriving. The name above the entrance was the same name it had always been, Kingsley Grand, in letters chosen for their permanence and their legibility from a distance. And behind it now was a different kind of story than the one the building had been built to tell. The man in the plain jacket who had first walked through those doors looking for the truth had left something behind when he stopped pretending to be someone else. And what he had left was not yet certainty or redemption, but the beginning of a hotel that might finally deserve the name it carried.